This is a story about the purpose of cinema and simulation, a likely story, a model that explains why these technologies emerged and how we should use them to better understand ourselves and the world.
Hey, you owe me way more than this.
Anthropologist Jean Rouch was an early adopter of handheld 16mm cameras, making films that provided a more faithful record of his research than text alone. But the presence of a camera can itself alter the reality being captured, a contradiction that Rouch himself, along with sociologist Edgar Morin, explored in the film Chronicle of a Summer, a research project on how people lived in Paris in 1961.
Seulement, je ne sais pas si nous arriverons à enregistrer une conversation aussi normale qu'elle le serait s'il n'y avait pas de caméra.
By deliberately drawing attention to the camera and staging artificial scenarios, such as having subjects watch and respond to footage of themselves, the film blurs the line between objective research and subjective artistic creation.
Si tu examines tout ce qu'on a vu là, je trouve que c'est un film extraordinairement pénible parce qu'une part de ce qu'on a vu est parfaitement ennuyeux. Et ce qui n'est pas ennuyeux, l'est au prix incontestablement d'une très grande impudeur.
This points to a central tension within the cinematic medium. While cameras can capture authentic slices of reality, those captured moments are influenced by the presence of the camera. But it's not only in cinema that we see this tension. In fact, the most pure form of this contradictory relationship between observer and observed emerged out of quantum mechanics.
There's something called the quantum measurement problem, which has been with us since the early days of quantum mechanics. How do you go from the fuzzy, hazy reality of quantum probabilities, where things can be in many locations with different likelihoods, to the single definite reality we observe when we do a measurement? We don't know how we go from one to the other.
If you think about how we normally image something, by capturing photons with a sensor, converting that light energy into an electrical charge, and so on, it's clearly not possible to image a photon itself, or any other particle, in the same way. And so, using similar technology to camera sensors, particles have to be found and classified based on their effects, based on the amount of energy they transfer to a detector, which means that, in order to measure particles, they have to be excited in some way. One way to do this is by accelerating them using magnets, and then smashing them together next to detectors. What this also means is that we have to imagine the behavior of these particles using mathematical models, and then check these models against the data. Despite these difficulties, quantum mechanics works. It correctly predicts the behavior of particles, not with certainty, but with probability. And this is where the measurement problem comes in. When particles are not being measured, they behave like a wave. But as soon as they're measured, they take on definite values in the form of individual particles. The wave pattern occurs whether we're measuring a single particle or multiple particles, which means that particles are somehow in multiple states before measurement, but a single definite state after. And when particles are entangled, that is, they were generated together, or they've interacted or shared a spatial proximity, they continue to somehow act upon each other, no matter how much distance is between them. In other words, if you measure one particle, its complementary, entangled particle will also act like it's been measured.
Even so, we can still test quantum mechanics. We do the observations and simply determine how often we see a particle at one location or another, and we hope that those frequencies match the probabilities that come from the mathematics. But we've not been able to fill in the details of how to go from the fuzzy probabilities to the definite reality we all observe.
And I think that this contradiction at the center, a contradiction that has been plaguing physicists for a century, might actually be a blessing in disguise. A mystery that makes us want to know more about our world, while simultaneously shining a light on a contradiction at the heart of human knowledge.
Experiment can produce unexpected results, and that starts us guessing again.
The measurement problem in quantum mechanics is, of course, a metaphor for the contradiction in cinema. Subjects on camera change their behavior because of their awareness of the camera, not because of quantum entanglement. But like a particle detector, cameras capture real-world information automatically and without human interpretation. And just as physicists need to create the conditions that will allow for specific data to be captured, filmmakers need to create the conditions that will allow for specific footage to be captured. This could include set dressing, costumes, lighting, etc. But each story is unique and requires different conditions. For instance, the documentary The Act of Killing created unique conditions that had never been done before.
There was this weird opportunity to do something unprecedented really in the history of nonfiction film, to confront a perpetrator while the perpetrator still holds a monopoly on power.
This film follows perpetrators of the Indonesian mass killings of 1965, where a military dictatorship directly aided by the United States murdered over 1 million alleged communists. Typically, a film like this would be investigative, trying to squeeze information out of interview subjects. But because the perpetrators are still in power, they aren't shy about their involvement in the killings. They're proud of it. And so the filmmakers take a different approach. They have the men dramatize the murders they committed.
Itu definisi kejahatan perang. Itu buatan orang yang menang.
The questions in my head started to shift from what happened historically, which I was quickly understanding, to what is happening now, in which that the perpetrators want to be seen this way. Why are they boasting about this? For whom are they boasting? What's the function of this boasting? How do they think I hear it? How do they want their society to see them? How do they want the whole world to see them? And how ultimately do they see themselves?
What a camera captures is how a subject wants to be perceived. And so, just as physicists need mathematical models in order to interpret data, filmmakers need a world model in order to know what to capture and how that footage should be shaped into a story. In this case, the most important question is, why do perpetrators boast about the murders they committed? And the story is shaped around that central question.
Through Anwar's boasting, it became clear something that I think was true of everybody else, which is that the boasting is not a symptom of the lack of remorse, the lack of a conscience, but in fact the opposite. It's a desperate attempt to convince oneself that what one did was right. It's Anwar's attempt to convince himself that what he did was justified. You know, there's another death squad in the film named Adi, and he says in the film, he says to Anwar, killing is the worst, and to me, killing is the worst thing you can do. But if you're paid well enough, go ahead and do it. But the key to doing it successfully is to make up an excuse so that you can live with yourself afterwards.
Salah satu tempat yang sering kami laksanakan penyiksaan ataupun eksekusi buat mereka-mereka yang selalu kami tangkap.
And it's the effects of those acts, not the acts themselves, that are captured by the camera. the footage must be interpreted through a world model.
Saya tahu bahwa saya kerjaan itu salah, tapi saya harus melaksanakannya.
But it's the footage itself that provides the standard for truth, that roots a model in the real world. In AI, a world model is a system that builds an internal representation of the world and then uses that representation to simulate future events. Let's think of this as a simplified analog for human world models. These internal representations simulate space and time, but they can also represent concepts, stories, social structures, and so on. In documentaries, the filmmaker's intentions are usually to represent the real world as accurately as possible within the context of a specific question or problem. While in fictional genres, filmmakers depart from reality in purposeful ways. In both cases, however, the on-screen particulars are only intelligible in the context of an off-screen, imagined world, a mental model of reality that is necessarily simplified and supplemented by the viewer's imagination. And so, cinematic technologies allow us to experience particular moments in the real world that would otherwise need to be interpreted into language, and therefore give us the material to form a more accurate world model. And so, by having more access to the particulars, we can construct a model of reality that more closely resembles the world as it really is, at least in theory. Cinema alone is not as good, however, at creating worlds that are purposefully different from our reality, which is why these movies also require simulative technologies. While automatic technologies can capture an event itself, simulative technologies can create an event that never happened. One grounds us in what is, the other allows us to envision what could be. This relationship between reality and ideality, between models of what is and models of what could be, is fundamental to how we understand the world. As societies, we build models of how our social systems and institutions function, but we also envision ideal alternatives. For example, something like equality before the law is an ideal model that's always in tension with the inequality that occurs in the real world. In order to make the world more equitable, we have to create a model of the world as it is, a model that explains why particular inequalities occur, and then we need to place that model in relation to an ideal model, an equitable model. It's the tension between these real and ideal models that propels social change. In this way, our ability to both record and imagine reality expands our capacity to understand and reshape society and ourselves. In the 1940s, French film critic André Bazin defined total cinema as a total and complete representation of reality, the reconstruction of a perfect illusion of the outside world in sound, color, and relief. At the time, Bazin was making an argument that cinema should embrace new technological developments, like color and sound, and thought they were pushing cinema closer to what it ideally could be. In an essay called The Myth of Total Cinema, Bazin compares total cinema to human flight. Long before airplanes were invented, humans had dreamed about flying. It was an ideal. And eventually airplanes were invented in order to meet this desire for flight. Similarly, the ability to perfectly replicate the outside world has long existed as an ideal, and so inventions have been created to try to fulfill that ideal. From this perspective, the development of cinema from silent film to sound, or from black and white to color, are actually stages of development taking cinema closer and closer to the ideal of total cinema, an ideal that has existed in our minds since long before cameras were ever invented. But a lot has changed since the 1940s, so let's do a thought experiment and apply the criteria for total cinema to a new technology, like VR. So, does VR create a more total and complete representation of reality than traditional cinema? I think everyone would agree that it does. The thing that VR does really well is replicate how an autonomous person experiences the outside world. There's no predetermined frame for you to look through. You choose where to look, just as you would in the real world. And besides vision, there's also a greater possibility for engaging the other senses. If you were to also be on an omnidirectional treadmill, wearing haptic equipment that imitated touch, and a machine that emitted smells, your experience in VR would actually be pretty close to your experience in the real world. So, again, yes, the way our senses are engaged more closely imitates reality. But this is where we need to make a distinction between VR as cinema and VR as simulation. There are live-action VR movies, but they're kind of only VR in name and not in substance, because you can't move through the world in three-dimensional space. Basically, it just gives you a bigger screen to look at, a 180-degree screen or a 360-degree screen. And even if the virtual world were photorealistic, it still wouldn't be cinema because it wouldn't be rooted in the real world. It would still be a human interpretation, a simulation. For example, a photo reproduces the real world automatically, but a painting is interpreted by an artist. The photo can't lie, in other words. As Bazin says, the photographic image is the object itself, the object freed from the conditions of time and space that govern it. A painting could be more detailed and give us more information than a photo, but the information we're getting tells us more about the artist's view of the world than it does about the world itself. And so, even as simulations become more photorealistic, they don't get any closer to giving us durations of time from the real world. In the same way, generative AI models don't create cinema, they simulate cinema. They learn from disparate footage that was captured in the real world in order to simulate a new event that never happened in the real world. They interpret, much like a painter interprets. The very thing that makes cinematic technologies unique is that their medium is captured durations of time from the real world that can be played back and experienced over and over. And so, VR as we think of it, where a viewer is able to move through the world in three-dimensional space, doesn't exist for cinematic technologies. But let's follow through with this thought experiment and assume that the technology will exist one day, that we will be able to experience recorded durations of time in three-dimensional space. Instead of filmmakers choosing the lens and camera angle, viewers would be able to autonomously move through space and watch and listen to a duration of time from whatever angle they choose. When you, for instance, are watching an interview, but then while the subject is talking, it cuts to a close-up, you implicitly understand that a decision was made to remove some of the dialogue in order to shorten or, in some cases, create an entirely new meaning out of the subject's words. And when a subject is talking and suddenly we cut to B-roll, we can only assume that we're listening to a chaotic mess of spliced up audio hiding under a veil of B-roll. A more total and complete representation would reduce the filmmaker's ability to create false meaning from that footage. It would, in other words, provide more substantial evidence for the model of the world that the speaker or the filmmaker is trying to communicate. This becomes even more important when events are more complicated than a one-on-one conversation. Think about how events are televised versus how they're experienced in reality. Whether we're using some iteration of VR cameras or more traditional cameras, the purpose remains the same: to automatically capture durations of time, allowing us to perceive particulars about the world, and therefore giving us more material from which we can create an imaginary model of the world as it is. Taken together, cinema, simulation, and imagination serve an overarching goal: to better understand the world and how we should live in it. By turning the complex real world into intelligible models, we can envision a better future and take steps toward it.